Hello, thank you for joining us for this professional learning opportunity. I am Scott Matthias from NCEA, and I will be your host today. Today's webinar, 3 Types of Reading Practice That Guide Greater Literacy Growth, is being led by Julie Vogel, Jan Bryan, and Jean Kearns of Renaissance. Julie, Jan, and Jean, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Scott. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you may be. Again, my name is Dr. Julie Vogel, and I will be your Renaissance host today for the remainder of the webinar. I would like to start, though, with a very short prayer. So if everyone could take just a moment to prepare your head and heart, we'll go ahead and get started. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, we come to you today asking for your guidance, wisdom, and support as we begin this webinar. Help us to engage in meaningful discussion, allow us to grow closer as a group, and nurture the bonds of community. Fill us with your grace, Lord God, and continue to remind us that all we do here today, all that we accomplish, is for the pursuit of truth, for the greater glory of you, and for the service of humanity. We ask these things in your name. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Just a couple quick words about me. You can see some of the things I've done up here on the screen. I've spent my career in various aspects of education and taught anywhere from preschool to 8th grade and undergraduates to PhD kids. And when I'm not obsessing over my passion for education, I do like to contribute to helping kids learn, and I spend my free time in very creative ways. So often right now, the creative venue of choice is wood turning. So we will keep you updated on that as we continue on. Next slide, please. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Renaissance. Today's webinar is sponsored by Renaissance, where our mission is to accelerate learning for all. We do this by providing assessment and practice solutions, along with the right data and connections to help you develop strong readers at every single grade level. We currently serve more than 2/3 of our U.S. Catholic schools, and we are a proud NCEA partner. We invite you to all learn more about Accelerated Reader, Myon, and our other literacy products by visiting our website, renaissance.com. Next slide. Oh, today I'd like to introduce you to your presenters. They are very passionate folks. Very passionate about teaching and learning, and they are also, like all of us on this call, 3rd-generation teachers, published authors, researchers with incredible content depth that they love to share with others so that we can support learning for all of our kids. So Dr. Jean Kearns and Dr. Jan Bryan are going to be your presenters today. So please welcome aboard the 2 of you, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks everybody for joining. Jen and I are going to do a little tag team. I'll kind of take you through some of the research, and then she's going to share with you some free resources. We have a lot of tools we want to show you today, and they include things that you do not have to be a Renaissance customer to use. So there's something definitely for everybody today. The usual kind of stuff. Yes, there's a recording. Yes, you'll get the slides. Put your things in chat. Put your things in questions. We have a whole team of folks standing by to answer your questions and take care of all that kind of stuff. But if there's any positive outcome of all of these latest disruption is we've all gotten really good at doing remote stuff. So it's a lot easier than it used to be. So let's get ready to dive in. I want to start with a really important idea. And that idea is that reading is not a homogeneous activity. And what I mean by that is it takes many forms. So reading is someone, curled up in a window with a good book or in a hammock. Reading is also a student intently doing repeated close reading of a scholarly academic text to be able to extract from it the details and the information that they need in crafting a written response to it. Reading could also be just skimming the titles within the chapter headings or the outline of a work to decide whether a more close reading is necessary. So in those senses, reading can be extremely mindful or it can be almost mindless. It takes a variety of forms. And what I want to primarily impart to you today is the idea that Since reading takes so many forms, it should not be a surprise to us that the reading practice, that the things that we have to help students do through our instruction, it also takes many different forms. And so we're here today to talk about the 3 different types of reading practice that we as teachers should foster among our students. And I'll use this little acronym here, T, W, and I. They stand for the 3 different types of reading, and those individual letters stand for reading to students, reading with students, and then supporting students in doing wide independent reading. And we're going to go just in that order. We're going to begin with a discussion of what is the research around reading to students, why is it important, how do we do that? We'll talk about some ideas about reading with students, and we'll end up with students reading independently, and hopefully give you a more comprehensive view of the wide variety, again, of practice activities that students need to be or to become highly literate. But that does bring us to our first poll question today. And here it is for you. And Julie's going to help me out with the polls. So Julie, what do we have on our poll today?
All right, very simple question today for all of our teachers and librarians in the group, even our administrators. Do you read aloud to your students each day? Very easy, yes or no question. If you could please go ahead and respond.
And we probably, and I'm thinking about it now, we probably should have made a 2-part question, because I would like to also do is like tease it and break it down and to say, if you're reading to your student, are you an elementary school teacher, a middle school teacher, or a high school teacher? Because my guess is that if we were to disaggregate that, we would probably find that reading aloud to students generally kind of drops off as students age and make their way through the grades. So just a couple seconds more for folks to respond. I think we've seen everybody here. So I will share the results with you. 50-50. Someone voted or changed their vote very quickly. Someone else came right there in the end. So 52-48, plus or minus a margin of error. We'll call it 50-50, with about half of you saying you do that each day, and another half of you saying roughly that you do not. Well, let's talk about why we really do want to be more regular about reading to students. And what I would say is I can make a variety of cases for why to do that. And some of those cases are logical and some of those cases are emotional. So let's start simply with the logical case around reading to students. And what I'll say is there are 2 reasons why, just looking at it logically, that reading to students is so critical. The first reason that it is critical is because human beings are pre-wired to learn language by hearing it spoken. And what I mean by that is think about how much language young children take in naturally. The parts of our brain that associate sound and meaning, they're connected at birth. And so we, again, are pre-wired to take in language by hearing it spoken. So if you take a look at this graphic, which actually was adapted from something that Jim Tripoli put out years ago, he said, we read to students because in reading to them, we fill up their listening reservoir. We input to them all kinds of words. And after they've heard those words will spill over from the listening reservoir into the speaking reservoir. In other words, after a student has heard a word several times, they will begin speaking that word. And think about those 2 reservoirs. Those things take place. That's happening before a student comes to school. And then they start showing up at school and we start dealing with the reading reservoir. Okay. And we start teaching them how to interpret the symbols and the sounds of our language. That part we're not as naturally pre-wired for. So it takes some instruction. But if you've been read to a lot and you've been speaking these words, well, then when you encounter them in print, your comprehension is fast-tracked, because when you sound out a word you think you don't know and sound it out and find that you do know it, then comprehension is happening. And after students have been read to and spoken words and read words in print, they will begin to weave those words into what they write. But the whole point is we fill it in up at the top. We fill up that reservoir and it begins a cascading into all of the other types of reading that are going on. E.D. Hirsch puts it simply. He says, reading to students, involving them with lots of conversations, involving them in actively listening to all kinds of things. Notice what he says. 2 things. Number 1, fundamental to the language process. Filling up that reservoir is critically important. And number 2, as a result, he says, this needs to receive a great deal of emphasis. So we must plan for it thoughtfully. Emily Hanford, who writes a lot about the science of reading, she puts it this way. She says, when we teach kids the letter combinations, when we do those really important early grades phonics and phonemic awareness lessons, look at what she says. When we teach them the letter combinations of English, we give them access to sounding out over 80% of the words in our language. Why not 100%? Because English is full of irregularities. So our language is a derivative of many others put together. It is not a completely phonetically transparent language. But when we teach kids the basic letter and sound associations, they can sound out over 80%. Now, notice what Emily said. They can sound those words out. She didn't say they could comprehend them. It made me think of Goff and Tumner's simple view of reading that you have down there. Decoding's part of it. You got to be able to look at the words and lift them off the page and sound them out. But when you sound them out, you need to know what they mean. You need some language comprehension. So if you can decode it and sound it out, and then associate it with a word you already know, if you have both of those things, then you are getting towards reading comprehension. Okay. And so that's why we need to be reading to students. Now, I will notice, or we do need to note, that it changes as we age. Okay. What this graphic is trying to depict is the idea that young children have the ability to listen to far more complex language than they can possibly read. We can say more complex things to them than they can engage with in print. And so what this is saying is that reading comprehension trails listening comprehension. Listening comprehension is more advanced when we are young. And then we start making our way through school, and those two get closer and closer and closer and closer. And you see they kind of converge typically when students are somewhere between 12, 13, 14 years old. So typically somewhere right around 7th or 8th grade, we get to the point where our reading comprehension and our listening comprehension converge. And so after that point, it's not quite the same. They're getting quite as much benefit when kids are older, but definitely for younger children, again, we are feeding that reservoir, filling it up with words by reading to them every day. Reason number 2 is because academic language, the language of books, is radically different from our spoken language. We go through the day speaking very, very simple words, very, very simple phrases, very, very simple vocabulary just to get through the day and do what we need to do. But man, oh man, when we sit down to write something, all of this different kind of language starts coming out. And one of the reasons is when we're writing, we don't have all those visual cues, all of those nonverbal bodily cues that we have. And so as early as 1979, researchers picked up on this. So Cummings was one of the first people to really delve into this. And in 1979, he published, some papers that began to explore the distinction between our conversational language and our academic language. And we don't need to look at this too closely, but many people have studied the way that academic language is different from our conversational language. For example, it is more formal, it is more abstract. Our sentence structure is more advanced. We start writing longer, more complex sentences there. We use much more sophisticated and much more abstract vocabulary. And we begin to bring in all sorts of rhetorical forms, such as figurative language. And also notice that last section down there. Academic language is encountered almost exclusively in school. So look at those books in the picture. The language that they are filled with is academic language. That language does not sound like the spoken language that students, pick up naturally. So as my co-authors and I put it in our literacy book, Literacy Reframed, we have a choice to make as educators. We either take the time to read to students or we don't. If we take the time to expose them to this more advanced language, we are preparing them to enter the world of books. We are purposely staking the steps to do that and prepare them to enter into that world of more advanced language. If we don't take the time to regularly read to students, then we are hoping, somewhat potentially against many odds, that students will somehow be successful when they encounter that unfamiliar word of more advanced language, which I contend is not all that likely. And so we need to read to them regularly, because what it does is it wades them into the water. It gets them in there and gets them acclimated to that academic language. Now, we've covered a lot of things so far. So for just a second, I want to hear from you very quickly. Will you post one idea or one insight, anything that I've said that was interest to you in chat? You're allowed to have questions too. If you have a question, and you're allowed to, push back a little bit if you need to and ask questions. I'm a big boy. I know my research, so I'm fine with people asking exploratory questions. Take just a second and let me know anything you're reacting to in chat. What do you have to say today? Okay, does it matter if the teacher is reading to the students or other students? It doesn't matter. So if you have a student that is capable of reading to other students more advanced text, absolutely. Or audiobooks. There's a new one where technology is coming in. Audiobooks can be a powerful piece there. Betsy says, I would love it if you have any comments about academic language, especially for students who speak a language other than English at home. Oh, Betsy, we need my colleague, Dr. Carol Johnson, who specializes in second language acquisition. You're right. It is that much harder. They need that much more vocabulary. They may not have the language there. Julie or Jan, you're welcome to chime in too. The chat kind of got away from me. So if you saw something that was there, let's see. I'm seeing a couple more messages coming in. Is there a list of books that should be read to students in order to increase academic language? We can look at the complexity of books, and we have some tools that we'll show you that help you choose topics. And we're doing more analysis around vocabulary, which I think is part of your question there. I see Catherine said, what do you suggest regards to reading a textbook lesson or chapter? Should be mainly the teacher or popcorn read, since it's a little tricky for some students? Catherine, I think you've got to make that decision. And I think part of your decision is, how close are your students in terms of their reading abilities to the textbook? And we know that some textbooks are rather advanced. So I think the more there is a gap, the more that you want to read. And we're going to talk about that academic reading in its own right in just a minute here, and we'll get a little bit more. Michelle made a comment. We want kids speaking in academic language as they become high school kids and adults. Absolutely. We want to foster those conversations. Julie, anything else that jumped at you? Because while I was doing those, I saw 5 more messages in there.
Nothing per se to this, although I think the same applies to adult learners as well. I just remember getting my PhD, and I had moved from curriculum and instruction to cognitive psychology. And I had some background knowledge issues and missing links, and it took me a long time to catch up to my peers. I had to learn a lot before I could speak the language, and listen to a lot of lectures before I could keep up. So I think it applies across the board, even as adult learners.
And I love the conversation in there about elevated discourse. If that's something that our society is missing out on, we need the ability to have more elevated discourse. So I second that, and I advance that as something definitely that we need. We talked about the logical case. Let's look at the other side. Let's look at the emotional case for reading to students. And Jim Trelease put it this way. Jim Trelease said, when you read to kids, it conditions them to do what? To associate books and print with pleasure. And there's a whole lot of parents that help out with this. Starting at a very, very young age, there's a whole lot of parents that are really filling up those pleasure associations for years. But there's a lot of parents that don't do that. So we have kids coming into our schools who have literally spent years associating print with pleasure because their parents read to them. And we have other kids who are coming in that may not have those associations. So they may not have any negative associations with readings, but they don't have all of that reservoir of the pleasure behind the activity. And what Jim Trelease and others say is, this is so important because, and Daniel Willingham gets into this as well, he says, our early associations with print are very predictive of how well we do in later reading. And here's why. Because learning to read is hard for most of us. Even if your parents read to you a lot, you get a big leg up in the process. But even then, you've got to learn lots of skills to read. So think about that student that was not read to every night as a child. They come into school with no negative associations with reading, but they don't have positive ones. And then we start doing the tedious work of, reading instruction, and it's hard and it's challenging. What Jim Trelease said in one of his books is the natural reaction then is to recoil from that. We move back as human beings from things that Aren't that fun? And so we've got to make sure that we're reading to students every day, because then we're giving that pleasure association. So even if we're reading to them part of the day and doing those hard lessons around reading instruction in another part of the day, by the reading to portion of our day, we're making those positive associations. And here's why it's so important. Look at what Willingham says down at the bottom there, because your reading attitude, no matter how old you are, your reading attitude is mostly emotional. Whether or not you choose to read, is based on whether or not it excites you, whether you see it was rewarding, whether you see any interest in doing so. So I said earlier that listening comprehension and reading comprehension converge somewhere around grade 7. Does that mean that we stop reading to students after about grade 7 or grade 8 or maybe 9 at the very, very latest, because there's no more building up of their listening reservoir because those two have converged? I contend, as do others, that the answer is no. We keep on reading to them because it's still creating those pleasure associations. Henrietta Dumby from the UK puts it this way. She says, for older kids, it may not be that filling up of language, but look what it does for them. It gives them a moment of relaxation among the tensions of their school days. It gives them a shared experience of enjoyment, enjoying a text with their colleagues in the class. Yes, I was the crazy high school teacher that started my class with 15 minutes of me reading aloud to my students every day as part of our English language arts block. And I remember a middle school teacher whose daughter was in my class, and Flossie came up to me and she said, Michaela came home so excited. She says, Mom, he reads to us every day. And that was something that for her was important. And she said, I need you to know she enjoys it. Now, how do we do it so it's maximum benefit? Rule number 1, don't read things to kids that they could read easily on their own. This is only optimally beneficial to them when we read to them more advanced texts. So the general rule of thumb in this space is read to students something that is written about 1 to 2 grade levels or more ahead of their current reading level. Now, you see the picture over on the side, and these are younger kids. I would love if I could find more pictures of people reading to older kids. They are just not out there. So secondary teachers, make sure you understand that even though some of the images aren't there, this is for you too. I want to see the sophomores and juniors and seniors having something read to them, okay? So general rule of thumb, things written about 1 to 2 grade levels ahead of where their current reading level is. But there's a little asterisk there. And you know what those mean? There's always some kind of exception. And here's the thing. When we talk about text complexity, how complex is a text? Remember that it's more than just the quantitative aspects of text. So what ATOS readability level does it have? What Lexile level does it have? What grade level readability does it have? Those are all quantitative conversations about how hard a text is. But as the authors of the Common Core remind us, it's not just about the quantitative aspects for text. We may also need to think about qualitative things, the kinds of things that either can only be measured or are best measured by a human reader, such as different levels of meaning. Some authors write a text and there's more than one level of meaning there, okay? So you take a text like Jonathan Livingston Seagull, very simple language, but it's talking about how you lead a good life. And when you're 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, you just quite haven't had enough life experience to fully engage with what that author is talking about. So a text could have level of meaning that requires some life experience or some particular background knowledge. Sometimes the structure of text will throw students off. Sometimes the language conventionality, sometimes it's somewhat different. I always had to begin by reading the first couple of chapters of To Kill a Mockingbird to students because the dialect was so different. It took them a while to tune their ears to the language of that book before they themselves were prepared to get into it. And then, of course, there are considerations about the individual reader, their motivation, their background knowledge, and the task. What are you asking students to do in the end? Are you asking them to sit back and enjoy being read to? Or are you asking them to answer some simple comprehension questions at the end? Or are you asking them to write a very thorough essay about what they read? Depending upon what the task is, it may also be something you need to juggle. when you consider how hard of a text to read to students. Doug Lemoff, who wrote Teach Like a Champion, wrote about reading to students. And here's what he said: avoid the common mistake. The common mistake that a lot of teachers make is neglecting to practice. If it's a book you've taught for years, you'll probably be able to read it pretty well out loud. But if it's another text that you haven't read a lot before, read it a couple of times in advance of getting in front of the class and reading it to them. Because, as Doug suggests, reading should be like making music. Because when you do it well, when you read aloud well, there will be notes and rests and different links to it. That is part of just really engaging with a text, and students need to hear that to train their ears and build those abilities as well. I'm going to end soon now in this section of reading too. If you want more, here's a great book, Stephen Lane's book, In Defense of Read Aloud. And he wrote it because he said he needed to do just that, defend the practice. He said, because he as a teacher was always nervous that when he read to aloud that his administrator might come into the room and say, Stephen, when are you going to teach the kids? As if reading aloud to students isn't part of teaching. But he says a lot of people don't get that, particularly for him as a middle school teacher and me as a high school teacher. Not all my colleagues did that. So I look like this strange duck out of line with everybody else. But I kept reading to my students because I knew my research. I knew why it was a good thing to do. And Stephen took the time to write an entire book to say, here's the case. Here's how you defend the practice. Let me pause for a second. See, Julie, anything you want to add to that, or any comments you'd like to make, or anything that came in at chat or questions? I caught you off guard. Sorry. Shaking your head. Jan?
While you unmute, Julie, I'll have a couple of them. Jean, there were some questions about reading motivation. So I recommended Raising Kids Who Read. That was one thing, but just an example of what reading aloud does. You were actually reading aloud that Lemoff quote. Mm-hmm. And I've read that. I've read it a million times. But when you said reading aloud is like music, I went, what? Oh, an entirely new interpretation of reading aloud is music just sent fireworks through my brain. So reading aloud brings so much to the students and lets them engage in reading in such a different, unique way.
And Jan's a big musician, so she was primed to have that reaction. Julie, did you have that reaction? You're a wood turner, so maybe that didn't set you off when it was music.
Music does set me off, Jean. Classically trained cellist and pianist. So yeah, it works for me. And the practice, the right kind of practice makes a huge difference. And you do have to practice.
Julie is a Renaissance person, from wood turning to cello.
Right.
Very good.
How can one go wrong?
So let's press on. The second kind of reading. Okay, so we're leaving the independent reading. We're now transitioning into what takes most of our time, the academic reading. Okay, now I call it reading to students because I believe that academic reading is a mediated experience, and I'll explain what I'm talking about. So you can call it reading to students. You can call it you can call it reading with students, or academic reading, instructional reading, whatever term you want to use. That's what I'm talking about. And I think we need to realize that it is a mediated experience. And here's what I mean by that. When we do our instructional reading, and this kind of goes back to the question I think it might have been Becky asked about, well, what about the textbook? What if that textbook is challenging to students? Well, remember that the academic things we do, we mediate by creating those pre-reading activities. We bring up the background knowledge and warm things up. We focus in on vocabulary words that are central in the text that we're working with. We know that students may not know, and we do some targeted instruction right on them. And again, we deal with the background knowledge. When my students were reading To Kill a Mockingbird, I had to explain things like a WPA job. There's a reference to a character getting a WPA job. What does that mean? WPA, Works Progress Administration, part of the recovery after the Great Depression. Now, that's what it means. So every now and then we have to step in with a little bit of knowledge that helps the readers understand what's going on in a particular text. And then we model, particularly in developing discourse and critical thinking, we model our think alouds. We pause and we talk about, well, based on that, I'm wondering the following thing, or I'm questioning something that this writer is saying here. We need to find the answer there. Are they limiting this conversation? Where will they go next? What do you think We are modeling those think alouds. And so the academic instructional read with process is one that is very, very, very much mediated. And that brings us to our second poll question for today. Very quick one. Julie, what is that for us?
Are you in a state that uses the Common Core state standards or a set of standards that are almost identical to them, but maybe not called Common Core state standards anymore?
Yeah, and not to get too political, there's a lot of states where it's still kind of Common Core, but there's been a new label put on it. So you may or may not know. And it doesn't matter whether you do or don't, but it does help us just a little bit to know where folks are coming from. And wow, there's been a lot of shifts around the Common Core, but I'll show you the results in just a second. We've got a huge portion of the audience that's still in Common Core states. And that's fine, because Common Core did a whole lot around text complexity and a whole lot of pioneering, I think, instructional practices that have been woven into many other standard sets. So let me just quickly show you the results here. 85% of the folks are saying they're in a Common Core state, 15% saying not so much, and that's fine. So the reason that I asked that is because Common Core, they talked a lot about text complexity. They wanted kids to read grade level texts. So if you're in Common Core, grade level text is explicitly defined by this table right here. And if you're not in a Common Core state, my guess is there is some guidance in your standards about what constitutes a grade level text. And part of it is also left to teachers, because remember, it's not just the number. It's not just that a book like Of Mice and Men has a very shockingly low readability level, but it's dealing with more adult themes and bigger kind of questions. So even though the number on it, the quantitative aspect of that text is lower, its qualitative aspects and its maturity push it up higher. These are the kinds of conversations. But when you want just a number to guide what's going on, these were the recommendations made by Common Core. And so you're seeing it here in Fleisch-Kincaid and ATOS from Renaissance, Lexile, SourceRater, a wide variety of text complexity tools. This is what constitutes hard enough. But sometimes you have a book, and more often, maybe it's an article that you found online that you want to work with your students, and you're trying to figure out how hard it is. And that brings up Jan with our first free resource of the day. We're going to show you how to find the readability level of essentially any text you can put your hands on. So with that, I'm going to bounce it over to Jan. Jan?
All right, thank you. I'm going to open this up. We're going to look at some free resources. I'm going to start here with the source. So if you go to renaissance.com, you will see resources, and I'm going to show you 3 resources, and all of them are accessible here. So renaissance.com and then resources. We're going to look at the ATOS analyzer at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that up for you, and we'll look at, Jean was showing you the text complexity information here, and we have 3 different ways that we can use the analyzer. It's going to take text and give you readability information. One is to analyze just a piece of text. So as we do this, we just click on Analyze Text, and I want to know information about it. Well, let's say we're studying the Gettysburg Address. So I would click here, and I would go find text. So I would look in my text down here at the bottom, and here is the Gettysburg Address, and I will click on that and go right back here and enter it here. Now, students can also do this. They can copy some of their own writing and put it in here and have their own writing analyzed. Then they really become very proud of what they've done. For older students, if you wanted to, there's actually 5 different versions of the Gettysburg Address. They're available at the Library of Congress, and you could look at each one. The one he delivered was called the Bliss copy. That's the one we've just analyzed. But it would be interesting to see how the others were analyzed. But the ATOS level is 8.3, so that's a hefty text, but a very short word count. Average word length is not long, but look at the sentence length, very long. But look at the average vocabulary level. So you get quite a bit of information on this. Jean, we'll look at another way to use that later, but did you have any comments about this or anything you wanted to see?
No, basically, if you go back to that ATOS landing page, basically what it basically says is if you have a book, you can feed the whole book in, you can feed a section of the book in, or you can feed an article in. So you've got a short version or a long version. And as I pasted into chat, ATOS is simply our name for our readability formula, which is free and open to everybody. There's a longer story about what the A and the T stand for, but we don't have time to play Renaissance trivia today. But everything you need to know about that tool is available at that site Jan has shown you, whether you want to feed in a text, whether you can feed in the whole book or part of the book.
And Jean, one more quick thing about the books. You can put in part of the book, but if you have a text that you want to use and analyze, you'll just go right here. You'll need the word count, and then for the whole text, and then just an excerpt, and not a long excerpt of the text.
So you can measure a short article. You can feed in the whole book if you have it, or you can feed in part of the book and then tell the tool how long is the overall book. So anything you've got, we've got a tool that we can help you measure.
All right, now I'll stop sharing and give it back to you, Jean.
Thank you, Jan. So
and
taking
it, pull that up, just a couple of key points, completely open resource.
Yep.
You just click the link and you're there, and students can use it as well.
So text complexity is part of it, but let's talk about this instructional academic reading that we're doing. This is the kind of thing that we see in standards consistently, whether it's Common Core or not. All the states say something pretty similar. They talk about students reading on grade level text. We want them to read texts that are complex enough for them. But not only read them, we want them to respond to them. And it's more specific. We want them to respond with deep, open-ended questions based upon what they read. And when they respond, they often are asked to respond in writing. And when they write, there's often a desire or a requirement for them to cite evidence or give examples from the text in the response that they read. This is very, very challenging, very, very challenging to do all this stuff. Read a hard text, ask, respond to open-ended questions, write in response, give the details. And what Daniel Willingham says is, as a result of all that, as a result that we ask so much of students during their academic reading, he says there's two types of reading. We're talking about three, but his two types are academic reading and pleasure reading, okay? And he says, because academic reading is so challenging, we must make sure that in our minds, and as important, or maybe even more importantly, in students' minds, that we contrast these two, that we create time for them to do academic reading and tell them what that's like, and create time for them to do pleasure reading and tell them what's that like. And he says, we must do this. We must make these two things clearly delineated in students' mind, lest they confuse the two, unless they associate reading with just always being work. Because remember, some kids, they don't have as many positive associations about reading. And then if we make them read everything on grade level, open-ended questions, write about what you read, cite details, if we do that every time in anything that they ever read, that's not very fun, okay? Here's what he says is, as educators, we like to think that all that academic reading we're doing in class, we like to think that that's pleasurable. For kids, it's a stretch. It's a lot of work, okay? He says, academic reading, we don't use pleasure as our litmus test. We don't look at read on grade level, write in response to what you read, open-ended questions, cite evidence. There's nothing in there and says, and make it one heck of an enjoyably fun activity for kids. That's not there. You will not find any references to pleasure in the academic standards typically. Willingham puts it this way: academic reading feels like work because it is. It's hard to do all that stuff. But outside of our academic reading, we should also create time for kids to do pleasure reading. And as much as the standards are our litmus test over there, is it hard enough tasks? Are they writing? Are they citing evidence? Those are our litmus tests over there. But when it comes to pleasure reading, our litmus test should be pleasure. Can students enjoy some pleasure reading time and indeed report that it was enjoyable? And that brings us to our final category of reading, having students read independently, okay? Now I want to do a little level set here and make sure we're talking about the same thing. In Literacy Reframed, my co-authors and I framed it this way. We said, for our purposes, when we're saying students reading independently, what we mean is something that students are doing for pleasure. There's Willingham's litmus test. Something that they're doing for pleasure, and something over which they have a substantial degree of choice in terms of what they're reading. I do not mean we are not talking about finish this section tonight at home. Okay. So sometimes when we're reading our academic texts, we'll be halfway, 2/3 of the way through the chapter, and we say to kids, okay, we got it this far, you finish it at home. That is reading that is done independently, but it's not what I'm talking about when I say independent reading. I mean reading for pleasure, reading something that you have chosen yourself to read. Here's why it's so important. Students' independent reading is directly correlated with their growth and their performance. And we have for more than 20 years seen in our assessment data the reality that I am showing you right here. Students who read less than 15 minutes a day tend to be falling further and further behind. So in this chart, when we take a look at it, the unit down the side is the normal curve equivalent, or NCEs. For those of you that know NCEs, what you know is if it's an NCE of 0, you are holding your place. So if you start the year at the 50th percentile and you grow throughout the year at an NCE of 0, you're going to end the year at the 50th percentile, which is growing, just growing at average rates. Okay. So what this is basically saying is any student that's reading about less than 15 minutes a day is regressing, while at the same time, those students who are reading 15 or more minutes a day are growing. And again, this point of being above or below about 15 minutes a day, we've seen this for nearly 20 years in students' data. That is a very, very, very clear line. Students that are reading more than 15 minutes a day are growing, and students that are reading less than 15 minutes a day are slowly falling further and further behind. So 15 minutes is a tipping point. And then some of you all may remember Paul Harvey, the radio commentator. What was Paul Harvey's favorite line? He'd tell you part of something, and then he'd say, but now I'm going to tell you what. Let's see who's fast on the keyboard here. Now I'm going to tell you. Maybe there's not some Paul Harvey fans out there today. Paul Harvey's famous line was, now I'm going to tell you, thank you, Monica and Anna, the rest of the story. Here, sadly, is the rest of the story. About half the kids out there in the country, according to our analysis, don't read 15 minutes a day or more. Put those two things together. More than half the kids in the country, slightly more than half of them, are not reading enough on their own every day to keep up with rising levels of expectations, which means as this webinar has been occurring, about half the kids in the country are not reading enough to keep up with rising levels of expectation. They are falling further and further and further behind. That's why we spend so much time at Renaissance focused on literacy and helping people through our tools. And Catholic schools have been so wonderful to us, particularly around Accelerated Reader, because Accelerated Reader was first used in a Catholic school. The information that Accelerated Reader provides lets you know and lets students themselves know how well they are reading when they read. We now have over 220,000 book quizzes, and we add, I forget the number, but I mean, we're adding hundreds each month. As new books come up, they are added to the Accelerated Reader collection. And then a couple of years ago, we acquired Mayan, which is a digital reading platform where kids can have 24/7 access to tens of thousands of enhanced digital text, including audiobooks. Because remember, somebody earlier said, can kids, read to other kids? Yes, they can. And kids can have audiobooks read to them. There was also a question about second language learners. If any group of kids needed a lot of reading too, it is them, because they have not had as much oral exposure to language. So Mayan, with digital books that are also audio books where it can read to students every day, a powerful platform to continue to advance literacy. And practice adds up. This chart is just so telling, because what it says is, what does it look like over 13 years when a kid reads less than 15 minutes a day? What does it look like when a student reads between 29 and up to 30 minutes a day? How does it add up when a student reads more than 30 minutes a day? I'm not even going to look at these kids. You don't have to worry about them. Kids that read more than 30 minutes a day on their outs, they're totally golden. Look down here. Students who read 15 minutes or less a day, if you add it all up, that's only 1.5 million words across 13 years of school. Let me say that again. Reading less than 15 minutes a day adds up to 1.5 million words across 13 years of school. There are elementary schools out there that have the Millionaires Club. They recognize kids that read 1 million words in 1 year. Think about what the cumulative exposure to words does over time. One piece of research I was reading the other day said is the most direct correlate to reading performance is exposure to print. If some kids are only getting exposure to 1.5 million words across 13 years, we should not be scratching our heads about why they are not doing so well. Kids that get up into this level, reading 15 to 29 minutes, remember, they're growing. And I'll tell you, being proficient is somewhere between these two, much, much, much closer up to this level than it is down here. Kids that are reading 15 minutes or more, they tend to make their way just fine through school. And these kids, the kids that are reading widely and extensively, they have powerful vocabularies. They have a lot of knowledge. They have a lot of critical thinking skills that are all built through their reading. They're going to do very well on the SAT and the ACT and admissions tests and standardized tests, and every opportunity they could ever possibly have is going to be opened up to them academically. We've got to make sure we get more students more towards the blue and the green lines than down towards those orange lines, because those orange lines do not go to college and career readiness very well. So independent reading for pleasure, kids get a lot of choice, but it brings up an interesting question. Do we need to manage that some? Do I need to guide kids to certain books? What if I've got some kid that only reads Goosebumps and that's all they'll read? Or what if I've got some kid that will only read graphic novels or science fiction? Do I need to do anything about that? The management of independent reading practice is a sticky question. Notice what Dr. Willingham says in his book, Raising Students Who Read. I think Jan put that in chat. It's a great one. He says, choice is enormously important. We want motivated readers. And one of the core ways of motivating a kid is to give them choice, because nobody's going to do the hard work of reading a text that they don't want to read. If they have no choice over it, it shuts them down. So he says we should give them a lot of choice. But then even Dr. Willingham's a little bit bipolar, because within the same paragraph, he says, but the teacher might want to provide some guidance, and the teacher might want to set some limits. And, oh, we need to think about text complexity, and we need to ensure the kids are exposed to a variety of genres. Do you feel the tension? Do you see why I put that tug of rope there? Because we as teachers are always trying to decide, do we tug? Do we push? It's a hard thing to do. It really is a hard thing to do. So I'm going to give you some guidance about how to manage it. And before I do that, it brings us to our final poll here. And I just want to know, how many of you have a formal program for independent reading? And when I mean formal, I mean you're using Mayan or Accelerator Reader, or there's other companies out there that have programs that help track this, in comparison with either no program or a program just like Dear, Drop Everything and Read, where it's just we create time, but I don't track it, I don't monitor it, I don't get feedback from how students are doing. Just take the poll really quickly to see what's going on. You know, there's great Dear, Drop Everything and Read. There's another one called, SSR, Silent Sustained Reading Time. There was another one, great acronym, SQUIRT, Silent, Quiet, Independent Reading Time. I had to think about what that meant, but there's all kinds of acronyms out there. And it's just like our poll a little bit earlier. Results are a little bit mixed. About half of you saying you've got a formal program in place. What I can tell you is the research is pretty clear. When we have that feedback of information about how students are doing, they tend to grow more. I mean, just allocating the time is a good thing, but if we can get a feedback of information both to us and to them about how they are doing, they tend to grow even more. That was based on a meta-analysis done by Keith Topping, University of Dundee, a number of years ago, where he said, just informal programs, the results are kind of mixed, but when you get into this more formal programs, the results are almost always positive. Here's my guidance about what you do. Manage your kids' independent reading practice, but not too rigidly. Here's what we know. When kids read a wide variety of genres, they grow more, but some kids are not willing to do that. You need to know who you can push and who you can't. We know that when students read on the upper end of their reading ranges, which, are embedded into programs like Accelerated Reader, we know that when they read on the upper end of their ranges, they grow more, but sometimes kids are not willing to be pushed. As a teacher, I had to know who I needed to push and who I needed to leave alone. And my colleague Seth is going to paste a recent blog that I did titled "Why Reluctant Readers Need Authors That They Can Trust." For some kids, I needed to step in and say, Jan, you need to read something far more complex. And for other students, I needed to say, Seth's never been happy in reading. He's found an author he likes and he's reading. And I know that it's a low-level book. I know that it is not the most scholarly literacy, literary work that is out there. But if he is happily reading, I need to leave it alone. And the blog tells a story of one of our first trainers and his son, who was a good reader. He was capable of reading, but he didn't do it much. And he found an author that he trusted. And that kid literally read every book in the county written by that author before he was willing to move on. And it bothered his dad, because his dad said, my advanced son should be reading something more advanced. And the librarian said, leave him alone, Don, leave him alone. Do not push him. He's never wanted to read all that much, and he's reading now. Leave him alone. So the best I can tell you is manage your kids' independent reading practice, but not too rigidly. Push when you think you need to push. And if you start pushing and they stop reading, back off. If you're doing anything that causes them to stop reading, back off. Because remember, when it comes to independent reading, what is our litmus test? Pleasure. It must be pleasure. And that's what we need to keep in mind all the time. Again, academic reading, per Willingham's word, feels like work because it is work. Pleasure ought to be the litmus test for pleasure reading. The other thing I will say is this, and we'll get ready to wrap up. We need to realize that independent reading, it's not something supplemental. It isn't just an additional add-on kind of thing. It is absolutely fundamental. Some people have Accelerated Reader, it's just their library program, or they'll say, and even in market, it calls this a supplemental program. I believe that daily independent reading practice is not supplemental. I believe that it is fundamental. And I believe that because the research is very, very, very clear. For example, David Scher, University of Haifa, published both in 1995 and 1999 works around what he calls the self-teaching hypothesis. And what he's saying is, when kids read, what do they teach themselves? Do you know that when kids read, they teach themselves vocabulary faster than we could ever teach it directly? So if you want students to have a lot of vocabulary, create time for them to read. Did you know that when students read on their own, their writing becomes more complex because they are inputting different models of writing? You aren't even teaching writing, and their writing is getting better. Did you know that when students read widely, it fosters all levels of critical thinking? Because every new book is a different way of thinking about the world. It develops critical thinking without any lesson. And I think you can certainly understand that when students read particularly nonfiction text and they build up knowledge, they learn about important names and dates and places and events, and that too is part of literacy. This article, or this particular reference to self-teaching hypothesis, comes out of the book on the side here, or was, it was an article written by Scher, where the book was titled Explaining Individual Differences in Reading. So basically what the book editor was saying is, how do we explain that some kids are great readers and some kids are not very good readers at all? Well, some of the articles in this book talked about things like dyslexia. Okay, some kids are not as good readers because they've got some challenges to overcome. But David Scher was answering the question, how do you explain all of the kids that have no reading disabilities? And some of them are fabulous readers, and some of them are not very good readers at all, even though they have every skill necessary. And his answer is because they did or did not do self-teaching. If you read a lot, you taught yourself a lot, you became a great reader. And if you didn't read a lot, you didn't teach yourself a lot, you didn't become a good reader. And part of our day as teachers is creating time for this to happen. Last quick free resource Jan's going to show you is how to find books, because We want kids to read. And what do we want them to read? We want them to find books. So anything we can do to get a good book in a kid's hand is a good thing. So Jan's going to show you our last free tool here. Jan?
Absolutely, yes. I'm going to pull that up. We're going to look at What Kids Are Reading site. That's our annual report. I've got 2 quick resources for you. But when we look at what kids are reading, this says download a report. So it gives the most popular books among all students. This is the 21 report. The 22 report you'll see on a slide is coming out very soon. So you'll want to watch for that. But when you are at this site, it will be updated to the most popular books that children are reading and taking AR or MION quizzes on. So we look at that, and you can actually at this site build your own list or actually shop for books that are very popular. So you pick your state and your grade level, and you can have a wealth of readability levels. So this is a great site, and I want you to be sure that you go here. So go to renaissance.com, resources and what kids are reading. Then first week in March, start looking for the brand new 2022 report. And then Jean, is it March 17th?
I think Seth is going to paste all the details in there for us. We have a webinar when this report will be released.
Excellent. And then the last resource I want to show you, completely free and open, is called Accelerated Reader Book Finder. This is where you can go through and look at all of the books available with Accelerated Reader quizzes. And I believe there's over 220,000.
Yes.
So you can go into Accelerated Reader Book Finder. You can look for authors. You can look by title. You can look by collections, like Newberry's and Caldecott's and state levels. You can look by topics. So you have a wealth of information, all free to you. And Jean, I'm going to turn that back unless you have anything else.
Yeah, if you want to go in, actually, let's just show real quickly. The first time you go there, you'll get the screen that Jan says. So are you a student, teacher, or librarian? So choose teacher or librarian, Jan. The only difference is kids don't see any information about how they can buy the book. We don't want to sell books to kids. So if you go to quick search, if you know the book, you just type the name in there. Maybe you know of the book of Mice and Men, but you don't know what its readability level is. So you type in the name of the book and hit search. It'll immediately come back and tell you the readability formula of that book. But sometimes you come here because you don't know a book. You're looking for some books and you're looking for titles. That's where the advanced tab is. And when you go there, what you can do if you scroll down just a little bit is choose the interest level, which is the appropriateness of content. What grade level kids are you working with? You can put a reading range in and the next numbers there if you want to. You can say books as low as 2.0 or 3.0 up to 5.0, whatever range you want to put. And then under those additional criteria, you can choose topics. Maybe you're looking for something around, I don't know, let's go with classics, Jan. Classics for 400, Alex. And then sometimes when you've chosen the top category, sometimes there's another drop down. So we'll see whether there is or isn't down there. We can look in there. So classics, retelling of classics. So the original classics themselves, and then you can search. And so you go on from there. And there's also, history is in there. The arts are in there. Everything is there. All kinds of titles that you can use. And on the very first landing page, if we go back there actually is a video about how to use Bookfinder. So we didn't have as much time to go to all the features today. There are collections for your states that are in there. So if there's published book lists for your states, they're there. And for some textbooks, there's even some matching up in there. But again, on the landing page for Bookfinder, there's a video that says, click here to learn more about Bookfinder. So you can use that to watch through there. And there it is right there. It says, watch this brief overview. And with that, Jan, I'll take the screen back from you and we'll get ready to wrap up. So last couple of things. I think Seth pasted in the date here. That'll be the What Kids Are Reading 2022 release date. So you can see 2022's most popular books. And I'll end with this last idea. Did we really need a whole webinar to explain the 3 different types of reading practice? I believe absolutely we did. And here is why. 2 reasons. Number 1, different rules govern what constitutes success in each level. And number 2, people mess this up all the time. I've been dealing with these questions for 20 years myself, and often the questions involve misunderstandings about what kind of reading practice are you talking about. So here's just an example of the rules. Remember text complexity. Read to kids about 2 grade levels ahead of where they are. Have them read independently in those reading ranges suggested by groups like Metametrics, the creators of Lexile, or our own accelerated reader levels through ATOS. And then, of course, when they're reading with students and we're doing our academic reading, that's grade level text, whether it's defined, very specifically by the Common Core or called out in some way in your standards, different level of text. Read to them harder things. Read with them on grade level things. Let them read things they can read on their own. Different rules govern success. And the other thing is this: don't add too much on to the pleasure reading to the point that the litmus test of pleasure will be failed. Some people said, I want kids to write about everything they read every day. Well, if you have to write a short journal entry or do a lot of work around pleasure reading, you slowly sap the pleasure out of it. It may not be all that fun. These are 3 different, distinct types of reading practice with different rules that govern what is success for them. Hopefully, there were some insights here for you, and I think we have just a moment or two for a question. Julie, Seth, others, what do we need to do in wrapping up?
We probably need to wrap up. We're running a little bit behind schedule today, but if you do have questions and you want to go ahead and put them in there, I'm sure we can get back to you. Most of them we've answered as we've gone along, so I feel really confident about that. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And before we go, just a couple of reminders. I'd like to invite everyone on this webinar to contact us with any questions you have about Accelerated Reader, Mayan, or any other Renaissance programs. You can call us at the number you see on the screen, or you can send an email to educatordevelopment@renaissance.com. I want to thank everyone here for joining us today, and thank Jean and Jan for their expertise and sharing what they know with us. And we hope to see you in March at our next NCEA webinar. And so, Scott, I'm going to send it back to you to send us home.
Thanks very much, Julie. And one big thank you to all of our friends at Renaissance for this presentation. Very informative and good dialogue with our audience here today. So thank you all. And I also wanted to remind everyone that for the first time in 2 years, NCEA will be back in person for our convention in New Orleans. And that's April 19th through the 21st. And if you want any information on that, you can go to ncea.org/NCEA 2022. And we look forward to seeing Renaissance there. And also any of you who are able to attend in person. Again, thank you, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you in New Orleans.